Shalom, this is Rabbi Linzer, and I'd like to share with you a question that we received from one of our rabbis in the field. This rabbi writes that a congregant recently remodeled his kitchen, and he wants to put in porcelain countertops. And the question is, can he do that? Because if something happens and there's some spill, will he actually be able to kasher it? Can you kasher porcelain? And this can occur in cases much more severe, where somebody is buying a house and the countertop is already porcelain, and it was owned by a non-Jew, and clearly treif was used. What do you have to do with a porcelain countertop? And some rabbis will rule in that case, number one, that you can't kasher porcelain, and number two, that you can't use a countertop that hasn't been kashered, and they'll rule that you have to completely rip out the countertop at the cost of tens of thousands of dollars. Now, in my mind, this ruling is completely wrong, and it is causing a great loss to Jews, a hefsed beruba, and we should not be following that. And actually, shockingly, both of those assumptions can be seriously questioned. Number one, can you kasher porcelain? The assumption that you can't is very much in question. And number two, kashering a countertop. That actually, it might be you don't need to kasher a countertop at all. Let's go ahead and look at those two. The first one, kashering porcelain. Porcelain is a type of a kli cheres, of a pottery. It's made from clay, it's put into a kiln, and therefore many will assume pottery absorbs, can't be kashered, you're stuck. Porcelain is the same. Now, porcelain is different than pottery in that it's fired up to even higher fires than normal pottery, that it's double or triple put in the kiln, and it's made specifically to be non-porous, to non-absorb. So is this the same? So the Radvaz already ran a test, and he said, I used it before, I used it, and I weighed it before I used it, then I cooked something, then I weighed it after I used it, and it weighed a little bit more. So that shows me that it does absorb, and therefore we have to be strict. And that's the way many poskim paskin, following the Radvaz and his ruling, and saying both a combination that it's pottery and that it does absorb. But there's a significant number of poskim who disagree, who say that today's porcelain and today's ceramic is pottery that could in theory absorb, but there's a glaze, and the glaze prevents absorbing. Just because they're pottery do not follow the laws of the Gemara, because fundamentally they don't absorb, like the Gemara says. And the Radvaz says, let's do an experiment, so we'll do an experiment. And maybe in the Radvaz's time it was cracked, it was somewhat not perfect, but nowadays these things completely do not absorb. And not only is it possible to kasher them, you don't need to kasher them because they're completely non-absorbent. And there's a non-trivial number of poskim that rule this way. More and more poskim are adopting this position. The Rosh Yeshiva Responds, Rav Vosner, says that the practice was not to kasher porcelain or ceramics, to assume it does not need to be kashered. So that's number one. Number two is the countertop. Do you have to kasher a countertop that absorbs treif liquid? And shockingly, the answer is no, you do not. Why can you have to kasher a pot after it's a day old? It won't treif up the food. And the answer is, the rabbi said, well, you have to do it because you might come to do it when it's a day old. But it's the same day, and you'll use it and it will treif up the food. But countertops are used for pots. They're not used for putting hot, yad soledespo, boiling hot food on top of them. And therefore, they are not made for absorbing food. And by koshering, we go by what it's traditionally made for. And even if it happens that you spilled and we want to say, well, it happens, you should kasher it, but you're not going to use it for the purpose of putting hot food on it again. If that happens again, it's an accident again. So you're not transgressing the rabbinic idea that you're not allowed to use it for a second time, because you're using it just for the pots, not for the hot food. So you actually do not have to kasher countertops, even though they are treif. This is the ruling of the Ramah in Orach Chaim and in Yeridea, and he says that there's a chumrah in order to put boiling hot water on it to sort of kasher it that way, but that's only a chumrah. And the Aruch HaShulchan says that if that will damage the countertop, you do not have to do it. So bottom line, what do you tell somebody with a porcelain countertop? You tell them two things. First of all, porcelain, there's positions that you don't have to kasher it. We maybe not adopt that lechatchila, but certainly that's a very weighty position. And I would sort of say that that's a position we should really give serious weight to based on the reality. So, number one, it could be you don't even have to worry about it. But more significantly, it's a countertop. And from the real halacha, you don't have to kasher a countertop. So, therefore, if it's possible to pour boiling hot water on it, you want to follow the Ramah, you want to do an act of koshering, be my guest. But if that will damage or potentially damage the countertop, don't do that. Just leave it the way it is. If that feels awkward, use like some type of harsh cleanser. Maybe that'll get in and make any absorbed taste problematic. Makes you feel good. You can go ahead and do that. But basically, if you can't do boiling hot water, then you have to go ahead. Then you don't have to go ahead and do anything. The whole thing is kosher. And that should really be the way we rule about this, to recognize both that porcelain might not absorb at all, and even if it absorbs, countertops do not need to be kashered. And when therefore it'll cost money, just accept it, use it the way it is, and you're fine. All the best.